Okay, recording has started. Welcome to the Manhattan GMAT Study Hall for April 26th. So today's theme is a number of different kinds of modifiers that have appeared in various ways on the test and that are tested and that are often confused in certain ways. So students have asked questions about these types of modifiers in various formats. So I've kind of compiled them into an overall presentation that, for lack of a better word, can be described as a modifier workshop. So welcome, and let's start with the usual rules. So, okay, you guys know the drill by now, but let's do this relatively quickly. Please don't submit things that are too general. Basically, don't submit things that amount to half the entire test at once. So not how do I solve things fast, and not like a huge sweeping category like geometry. At the same time, probably the biggest issue, please don't submit problems that are too specific either. You want this sort of golden mean where the problem is not too general, but not so specific. The specific problems belong on the forum. So if you just have a single question and you're asking about a couple of very particular answer choices, please submit on the forum. Also, please don't submit personal issues. This is not the place for that. There is a folder on the forum that is the place for that. That folder is the general questions folder on the forum, the purpose of which is precisely to address such things as study plans and what have you. So what we should see is topics of intermediate depth. Today, people have asked about various general classes of modifiers. They haven't asked about all modifiers as a whole, because that would not be a realistically, that wouldn't be a realistic topic. But they also didn't ask about one problem either. They asked about a type of modifier, like modifiers with the word that, or modifiers that are pushed around the sentence in certain ways, and so on. So that's what we want to see. Also, you can't use the official guide. The GMAC people have explicitly asked us to not use the official guide in our presentations and on our forum, so we have to honor that request. So again, no official guide. Don't do this. We can't use it. So, and don't submit single questions without a larger context. If you do have just random single questions, then please, please, please post them on the forums. And then please don't be demanding or rude. This is, after all, a professional enterprise. And so all the usual rules of ethics and all that kind of stuff. Not ethics so much, but all the usual rules of politeness and etiquette. Etiquette is the word I was looking for. Apply here. Business etiquette, standard, common sense type of stuff. No personal study plans. Please don't do this. This is not the place. The general questions folder on the forum is where you want to submit something like this. Also, if you're going to post something like this on the general questions folder, you need to ask something. So you can't just say, I got this score and I want that score, because that doesn't help us. You got to give us something to work with here. So same thing, one specific problem, please don't do that here. And then also, please don't ask what happened to a submission. We get about 50 submissions for every one that we can actually use. So be understanding about that situation, please. Also, please check the archives. A couple of people submitted problems in the last couple of weeks who clearly did not check the archives. For instance, we have one entire study hall session on number line problems, but we still had a person who asked about number line problems. So if you search you go to the same homepage for Thursdays with Ron that you would go to anyway, and you scroll down and you will see this large magical archive of session topics. It's a huge archive by this point. There's something like almost 60 sessions by now. So you should check that out before you submit topics. But we did a bunch of problems on number lines, for instance. And there were a couple other submissions that were basically things that are already here. I don't remember what they were, but please check first. And that's the rules. So smiley face button, please, if you understand that those are the rules. Okay, good stuff. So again, if any of you are just getting here, the topic of the day today is a workshop on certain types of modifiers. Modifier workshop. Mostly placement and modifiers involving the word that, but fun stuff. As usual, the problems that are in the study hall are from the official software. This is what we almost always use in the study hall, and the reason is that there's not a lot of really good problems out there. So most random problems from third parties are frankly just sort of bad. So we have to be circumspect about the sources that we use, and we're also not allowed to use the official guide. So what that basically leaves us with, as far as problems that have the imprimatur of the official people and that are also usable by us, is GMAT prep. So in case anyone's wondering why it's always GMAT prep kind of day in, day out sort of thing, that's why. I mean, there's not really a lot else that we are allowed to use that is good. Okay, when you answer the problems, please use the answer buttons. You should see those appear right now. You should see them underneath the window with all the names in it. When you click those, people will not see what you clicked. Please do not click 2 times. If you click more than once, what that will do is delete the thing you clicked the first time. So please click your answer just once. If you want to change your answer, please click the new answer just once. Any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box. Otherwise, we will get rolling. Okay, here's a sentence. Go for it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, remember what this test is. This is the GMAT. This is a test on which you have to answer the problems. So if you don't have an answer, please pick one. If you're Karthik, I'm looking at you. If you're Obi, if you're Roshin there at Gmail, I'm looking at you. You gotta pick answers. Okay, so here are your statistics as a group. All right, so let's take a look. We have it's not quite a majority, but it's a decently strong consensus on choice C. But let's take a look at these choices. Does anybody have a way to get us started here? Anything in the chat box? How do you get going on this problem? So the first thing, yeah, okay. So when you start a problem, the first thing that you need to do is, what does it mean? So remember that always the first step is, what's the meaning? So the meaning of the sentence is that this concern, which is a specific concern about the bank's loans doing whatever, is an obstacle to the congressional passage of the funding increase. So that's the point. Like, there's a couple of things you want to notice here. It's one specific concern that's the topic of the sentence. And then also you have to know what is what. So, and then what's being cited? Like what is cited in this sentence? Like what do legislators cite precisely? Yeah. So that's the other thing. What do legislators cite? Well, you have to cite, you're not citing an obstacle randomly. What you're doing is they cite the concern as an obstacle. Like the thing that they are actually citing is the concern, not an obstacle. So that's the way you should write the sentence. They cite this specific concern and they basically say this is an obstacle to the passage of this thing. So that's significant too. Because if you look at a couple of these other choices here, if you take a look at choice A, they cite an obstacle that's not really the point. They cite the concern is what it should say. So we don't like that. There's also the idea that you don't want to use being as a modifier. We've never seen an official problem. There are official problems in which the word being is correct, but not as a modifier. So we've never seen that before. So don't start modifiers with being if you can help it at all. I mean, you can use that as like an actual verb, like this person is being videotaped. But in a modifier, we haven't seen that ever happen in an official problem. But they're not citing an obstacle, they're citing the concern. What about a concern? What's the issue there? Does anybody see what the deal is? Yeah, it should be the concern. Notice this is not something you would normally concern yourself with, except for the fact that it's a split. This is a particular thing that they're concerned with. So it's not a random concern. It's like they cited this one very particular thing. So they cited the concern that blah, 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 blah as an obstacle. So this is the very particular concern that they're concerned with, not a random concern. All right. And then what about E? Least favorite of the audience here. But what's wrong with choice E? This is something that's very objectively wrong, if that helps. What's wrong with it? Yeah, it's a pronoun. I mean, what is that supposed to stand for? Like what is this? It's not that it's ambiguous, because ambiguous pronouns are not always an issue. And it's not a redundancy either. This is an objective pronoun issue. And remember, when it comes to pronouns, don't overcomplicate the issue. Like, don't think about stuff that you simply don't have to think about. Like, don't worry about ambiguity, and don't worry about, like, you know, all this other kind of stuff. Just, you know, what do pronouns have to do? Like, how do pronouns work? They have to stand for a what? They have to stand for a noun. And then if there is such a noun, it has to match in terms of singular and plural. And I mean, this is really the only thing you need when it comes to dealing with like 99% of pronouns. So you really want to make sure that you're not overcomplicating these issues. So pronouns have to stand for a noun. Well, does that happen? Let's address that issue. What is the it in this sentence? In other words, like what is Congress? I mean, to pass it. So what is supposed to be passed? Okay, the bill, but it doesn't say the bill. I mean, like, it's something that has to be in there, and it has to be something that they've already mentioned. It's, I remember, it's the increase. It's what Cal is saying in the box. It's not like other stuff that's random. There's no bill because they don't mention a bill. But the governments are expected to increase the funding of this World Bank. So the whole sentence is about whether we want to increase the funding of the World Bank or not. So this it is trying to refer to an increase in funds to the World Bank. The problem is there's no noun for that. I mean, this is not a noun up here. To increase, not a noun. So pronouns are supposed to stand for nouns. This one doesn't, so it's incorrect. Again, people's biggest issue with pronouns is they really love to overcomplicate the issue. But if there's not a noun, there's not a noun. And that's kind of the end of the story right there. So let's concentrate now on C and D, because that's really the reason that we chose this particular problem today. So let's focus. We've eliminated the other choices, but let's look at these two. And let's actually put these back into their context, which is what you always have to do anyway. Let's put these two back in context. So legislators cite as an obstacle to congressional passage the concern that the loans will blah, 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 versus legislators cite the concern an obstacle to congressional passage that the loans will blah, blah, blah. So what are they doing here? What they're doing is they're just taking modifiers and kind of shoving them around all over town here. So what is the issue when modifiers are pushed around to various locations? Does anybody know what you should be thinking about in that sort of situation? There's probably supposed to be a comma there. Let me put one there, because I don't think they would mispunctuate a choice. So yeah, it's a couple of you guys are getting at this here from various angles, but let me go ahead and copy some of the things that you guys are saying in the box. So yeah, here's what you should be thinking about. Here are 3 student comments that basically encapsulate what you should be thinking about. When you start moving stuff around like this, it's an issue of clarity more than anything else. Like you have this here, but now it's over here. And then you have this here, and now it's over here, and notice that this is also a modifier. So what describes what? I mean, yeah, this is basically what Bryce is saying in the box. Is a very, very nice summary here. So let's put that up as well. Keep the modifiers close to whatever they're actually talking about. That's really the heart and soul of it. Yeah, it's a very nice summary. So let's look at what the stuff is talking about here. Well, what is this blue thing describing? Like, what is that the loans will blah, 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 blah? Like, what is that blue modifier? An elaboration on. It's describing the concern. Like, that's what people are concerned with. So the blue part is a description of the concern. So that's one thing that we like about choice C, is that these things are actually next to each other. Whereas this one puts this random modifier in the middle of those two things for no reason. The other thing is that the meaning of the sentence is that the legislators are citing this thing as an obstacle. Like, the meaning here is that legislators are saying, hey, this is potentially an obstacle. So this is describing the way in which the legislators cite the concern. The orange does. So you should put that reasonably close to the word cite. Because, you see they cite it as an obstacle. So this means how are they citing it? Well, so you want that next to cite. So either one of these things, but especially the concern that the loans will do whatever, you don't really want to break that up if you can help it, because that's what the concern is. This is needlessly opaque and hard to penetrate. So the lesson that you should get here is when they shove modifiers around, it's not really some concrete issue of things like grammar or whatnot. It's really just, okay, they are making it more or less clear what these things are actually trying to describe. And remember, you don't have to make objective decisions of right and wrong here. You just have to say, like, these things are much better placed than they are here. Because it's not absolute right, absolute wrong. It's just this choice does the best job of this out of all the choices, which is a much easier decision to make. Questions about this? Otherwise, we will move on to another one. Okay, someone is typing. Can you help me understand why being is a modifier? Well, it's written like any other modifier here. It's like any other ing modifier. So if the question is like, how do you know this is a modifier, that's too basic of a question. You should go back and read up on ing modifiers and just look at examples until you can differentiate those. Meaning, like, basic structural units you should be able to recognize. So you shouldn't have to ask, is this a modifier or is it not? If you're not at that point yet, look at examples and look at sample sentences until you are at that point. Has an obstacle. In this sentence, it's describing the way that this thing is cited. So I'm not real big on terminology and stuff, but it's describing this action. That's how they're it's kind of like I think of this as an obstacle. So like, if here's a couple of other examples of that. Like, if you have, I think of this test as a fun puzzle. I treat this test as a game. So, I mean, these are both describing not the test itself so much as the way I think about it or the way I treat it. So this is describing this is not just describing the test, this is describing this action, and this is describing this action. So adverbial, or whatever word was that you used for that. But the point is that it describes actions. So, I mean, it's related to the idea of the test, of course. But if you had to most accurately say what is modified by that, you would point to the action. Okay. Let's look at let's address this question. It's in the box here real quick. Let's make this the last one before we move on. So, I mean, this question here, is there a specific strategy to approach this type of question? It depends on what your understanding is of when you say the split strategy. Because, I mean, a split doesn't have to mean like, oh, these things are directly underneath each other. That's not accurate. I mean, splits are just anything that is different at all between the choices. So split is anything at all that is done differently in different choices. So like anything that changes at all. So if modifiers are pushed around, that's a split. If you have a concern, the concern, that's a split. If you have, being or the concern or as the concern, split. I mean, when we say split, that's what we mean. It doesn't mean that you're literally taking out one word and substituting in another word. And I mean, if you're thinking of it in that way, that's way, way, way too narrow of a way of thinking about it. I mean, a split is just anything that is different. That's all it is. So including massive differences like shoving things around all over the place. So like this is a split. This is a split. This is not like multiple splits. This is one. Because the pushing around of these things is one idea. It's not a bunch of ideas. It's just like, where do these things go? So, I mean, it's anytime you notice that things differ at all, you're using at least what we think of as a split strategy. So maybe we're just defining words differently here. But the point is that you seek out things that are different and you analyze them. So, yeah. Okay, let's look at another problem. Clear out your answer choices. Let's try this one right here. This lovely piece of loveliness. Okay, it's a little bit longer. I'll give you a little more time. Okay, that's better. My microphone actually just ran away there for a second. So, all right, well, we've had plenty of time to answer the question. There's still two of you who don't have an answer yet. Those are Shweta and Vishal. So, you guys spend like 5 minutes. You should definitely have an answer. So, okay, here are the statistics for the class. So again, very strong consensus in terms of choice A here. Either you guys are super all-stars or you have seen these problems, but either way, it's a nice job. So let's take a look. Let's look at these sentences and talk about them. What do you notice happening here on a very large scale? Like, what are they doing with all these things in the sentence? Yeah, they're shoving stuff around all over town, right? So let's take a look at this. Stuff is being shoved around the sentence. So let's think about where should things go. So one modifier that's here is on hearing or when he heard or etc. What does this modify? It's supposed to be a question mark. What does this modify? Okay, yeah, when he heard that something had been made, he made his own. So this should modify the sentence. Not on a telescope. I mean, this is not, telescopes don't hear things. So if this couldn't modify a telescope. But this modifies the description, modifies the sentence describing Galileo's invention of a device. So therefore, this should be attached to that. This should be attached to the clause that says he built his own device. And ideally, it shouldn't be attached to anything else. So that's also a consideration. In 1609 should be attached into hearing, but that happens in all the choices. So that's not really a concern because it happens in all of the choices, but it's something that you would want to look out for. And then in turn, that whole thing should, yeah. So let's take a look at the way these sentences work. Here's on hearing in 1609. That's a smaller highlighter than I would like. Okay. There's that modifier. Here it is in choice A. Here it is in choice B. Here it is in choice C. Here it is in choice D. And here it is in choice E. Now notice the difference here, because like you can put prepositional things like on, hearing, or in whatever year. You can put those before stuff, and you can also put them after stuff. So there's a problem in choices C and D that doesn't exist in the other choices. And that's the following. Like if you've got, like let's take a look at this but here. Like but is a divider, meaning that the stuff on one side of but definitely is not modifying the stuff on the other side of but. Like but and are like walls for modifiers. Modifiers can't modify across things like and but. So in A, B, and E, the yellow thing has to be modifying what comes after it because the but is there blocking it from modifying anything else. So in A, B, and E, the yellow thing must modify the sentence that comes afterward. And that's what we want it to do. So we figure that out in the meaning of the sentence. On hearing that an instrument had been made, he made his own. This is what he did on hearing that someone had made one of these things. The problem with C and D is that we don't really know what it's modifying. Like, we don't know if it's modifying that part or if it's modifying that part. I mean, we know in terms of common sense that it's supposed to be the second one of those. But this is placed somewhere where we're not really sure what the heck it's talking about. It's not conveyed clearly. So this is not something you would necessarily be expected to pick up on cold. But when you look at this in comparison to those other choices, you should be like, aha, this could be modifying stuff that I don't want it to modify. So we don't like C and D for that reason. Any questions about that, go ahead and throw them in the chat box. What about other choices here? So, I mean, the main point of including this guy in today's study hall is, again, stuff shoved around the sentence. So this is a lot like those couple choices in the other problem. When things are moved around, you know, think about which choice first places them where they are supposed to be placed. But also on top of that, doesn't place them in locations where with more than one interpretation. So that's the point. I mean, you want to make it so that it actually modifies the right thing and so that it's clear that it actually modifies that. So there you go. Does anybody have any objections to E or B? It does turn out that A is correct. Yeah, B is not a sentence, right? So let's just, I mean, B and E are not the main point here, so let's get through this kind of fast. But here's the problem again. Like, B is not actually a sentence because there's no subject. Like, there's a big empty hole here where there's supposed to be a he. So you can't say, like, you know, I mean, here's an example of a sentence that's really a sentence. Like, when I heard the news, I became sad. That's a real sentence. Whereas B is kind of like saying, not saying, but writing. Like, B is like writing when I heard the news, comma, became sad. So I don't know what you would call this. It's some sort of sentence fragment, not complete sentence type of thing. But it doesn't matter what you would call it. Like when you see something like B, you should definitely recognize, oh my gosh, that doesn't have a subject. So yeah, you also have a having been made is not the most beautiful modifier in the world either. And there's that whole of plus noun plus ing kind of thing. Let me just drop a link in the text box to that rather than launching into that whole thing. Hold on just a second. Okay. All right. Just so we don't sideline this discussion too permanently, as far as the having been made thing, so like of plus noun plus having, check out that link. I don't want to bring that discussion into the study hall because it will probably start monopolizing things, and we don't want that. But if you want to read more about why this modifier is sketchy, then you can go to that link. But it should be a much bigger deal to you guys that this is not a sentence. So, I mean, be aware of that. Like, if you guys are too busy picking at small modifiers and not realizing that B is not even a sentence, that's not great. So, what's wrong with E? And what's wrong with having even though and but? Again, it's not a sentence. So E is not a sentence either. For example, if you say, I left home early, but I still got to the show late. That's a sentence. And if you say even though, you could have the same idea. Even though I left home early, I still got to the show late. That's also a sentence. But I mean, these are, I forget the name for them. I think they're called conjunctions or something. But the point is that they're things that connect stuff. And you can only connect these things once. You can't double connect them, otherwise you don't have a sentence. So even though I left home early, but I still got to the show late. This is not a sentence. This is kind of like having two ands. I mean, this is like having two buts or two ands. I mean, you can't have two of these connectors. So there. This is like even though I left home early, but I still got to the show late. I mean, you can also think of it as a redundant construction, but you got to be careful with that because if you're too overzealous with calling things redundant, you might actually try to rule out things like not only but also and stuff. So, but make sure that you can relate things like this to shorter things like this. B is like that. It's not a sentence. Seeing, I'm sorry, I actually don't even remember what independent clause means. So I'm not really a big terminology guy. So I would have to Google that up to answer that, which I could do during the next problem maybe. But I'll defer that question until I look up what those terms mean. Okay, someone's asking about verb tense. That's not a tense, Karthik. This is also a modifier that, yeah. Again, you don't want to start modifiers like that. No official problem has ever used a modifier that starts with being. Again, there have been problems in which being is okay. This is not a tense because INGs don't have tenses. This is not a verb. This is a modifier. So tense is something that doesn't actually exist here. But it is, your heart's not in the wrong place. I mean, you are looking at something that is sketchy. But the larger underlying problems in the sentence structure, make sure you notice those. Like, make sure you are not just looking at small little things all the time, like being and stuff like that. Okay. Had not invented and did not invent. In brief, both of those are okay. They're slightly different takes on the same thing. Like, even though he had not invented, is kind of like looking at it as a done deal. Like, oh, well, someone else had invented it. And so from that perspective of that time. Even though he did not invent is just two random facts from history. Oh, by the way, fact number 1, he didn't do this, but fact number 2, he did this. They're both fine. So in general, verb tense should be priority Z. It should be the very, very last thing you worry about. It's a very minor topic, and as in this problem, it's usually tested with other stuff. So you won't really have to be responsible for subtle differences like that. But that's the brief summary. Okay, good times. So again, the main point here is this stuff. Like, we have a modifier that is attached to different things at different points. And so we want to make sure that it's attached to the right stuff and that it's not also attached to the wrong stuff. That's kind of the idea. Any questions? All right. Let's talk about this one. Okay, that's time. If you don't have an answer, remember that this is the GMAT. This is a test on which you have to actually pick something. So if you haven't picked something, if you're a Shekhar, I'm looking at you. So yeah. Also, if you are Javian, don't know exactly how to pronounce that, I'm also looking at you. So yeah, hold on. Let's talk about this problem. So notice again that things are, here's your class statistics. There's a bunch of stuff just being shoved around all over the place. Looks like you guys didn't have too much of a hard time with this, so that's good. But let's look at what's being shoved around. Let's just go ahead and look at all the modifiers and see what they're supposed to modify. So a bunch of stuff is shoved around everywhere. So where are the modifiers? What should they modify? This is the question. Okay, well, everything here that's a modifier, and remember, you do need the baseline skill of being able to say what's a modifier and what isn't. So you should be able to at least pick modifiers apart from the rest of the sentence. So remember, I mean, here's just an illustration of what I'm talking about. Base sentence like the dog fell. That's no modifiers. If you say the dog that we adopted, that the base sentence is still the dog fell, but now the dog that we adopted at the shelter. The dog that we adopted at the shelter on Tuesday fell. The dog that we adopted at the shelter on Tuesday fell down the stairs onto the floor. And then you could even have an initial modifier thrown in there too. So like unaccustomed to interior environments, or to indoor environments or whatever. So like, okay, we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 modifiers, but there's still a sentence, which is the dog fell. So when you look at a bunch of stuff shoved around, what you should do is see what's modifiers and what isn't modifiers. And what are the things that are modifiers supposed to be describing. So here's everything that's modifiers. That when drafting the Declaration of Sentiments, that's a modifier. That's a modifier. That's not. That's a backward constructed sentence. Included was this, so that's the basic sentence. This is a modifier. That's also a modifier. And shows this. The different colors here don't mean anything. I'm just trying not to put the same color next to itself. This whole thing is a modifier, including other modifiers inside it. This is a modifier, and this is a modifier, and so is this. Okay, whoa, that's a lot of modifiers. But what we can do here is just look at if there's anything that's clearly attached to something that it shouldn't be attached to, then we can destroy it. So when drafting the Declaration of Sentiments, well, who drafted the Declaration of Sentiments? Like who should this be? This modifier had better be next to who? It should be next to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So it's not, so this is bad. Same thing with B, including a call for female enfranchisement is fine because the draft did include that. But that Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote is supposed to be talking about this draft, which is way the heck up there. So that's not so hot either. I mean, it's modifying something that's nowhere close to it. C and D, these modifiers are okay. This is actually not, C is not so much a modifier as it is a separate clause. Like when you have, let's make sure this is clarified here, because I think I called those modifiers, and those are not really modifiers. Make sure that you differentiate between, be able to differentiate between modifiers and entire clauses. So for example, if you say tired from a full day's work, I still had to help the baby, or like I still had to feed the baby. Tired from a full day's work, the baby still needed to be fed. And then let's look at these two. Even though I was tired from a full day's work, I still needed to feed the baby. Even though I was tired from a full day's work, the baby still needed to be fed. Okay. What's important to understand here is that modifiers have to modify stuff and full clauses don't. So these are modifiers, the ones that say tired from a full day's work. Like that's a modifier. And so those have to actually modify stuff, and so this first one is right and the second one is wrong because the baby was not tired from a full day's work unless it was a very unusual baby. So, but these actually modify stuff. And versus entire clauses which don't. So they don't modify particular elements. So as long as they're placed in some place that makes sense, those are fine. So both of these latter ones are correct because they both make sense and you're not modifying me or the baby because those are separate clauses. So the first pair, this one's correct because it's correct modification. This one's incorrect. These two down here, though, are both fine. So for that reason, these clauses in C and E are not issues because these are like the bottom two. If there's any questions about that, go ahead and type them in the box. Otherwise, just remember those kind of examples for future reference. Because when stuff is modifiers, you have to worry about it precisely where it's placed. If it's clauses, you don't so much. Okay, well then what's wrong with C and D? Any ideas? Text box? Yeah, D is not a sentence again. So we had all these non-sentences last time. We're going to have that again. So let's take this to the next page. And I don't know what the highlights are doing there. So let's look at C and D. Well, D is not a sentence because you've got a call for female enfranchisement included in blah, blah, blah is a modifier, and that was adopted as another modifier. So D is not actually a sentence. It's just a call plus modifier plus modifier. There's no verb. So D is bad. What about C? When they don't really test non-essential versus essential cal. If you're going to say different meaning, go ahead and explain exactly what the meaning difference is, please. There's two problems. Again, one of them is a verb tense problem, but remember that verb tense problems very, very rarely are things that you actually have to use. So let's come at that from the other angle. Like this says when. So does this. When you say when, that has to not be a lie. So if you say when x, comma, y, it must actually be true that y, when x happened. Like, in other words, like the time frames have to be right. Like the time frames have to match. So let's look at what they're saying. Like, what's the message in C? Like, C is saying when the draft was adopted, a call was or whatever had been whatever included. I mean, this doesn't make sense because, I mean, this must have been done way before when the draft was adopted. Like, this is a much later time frame. So this doesn't make sense. On the other hand, if you look at choice E, when ECS drafted the declaration, she included, and this makes perfect sense, because when did she actually include stuff? Well, that's actually when she did it. This is precisely the time when. Precisely the time when she included the call. Is when she drafted the declaration. That's exactly when she did that. So, right. Satish, where are you going with that? Yeah, okay, although, I mean, it was drafted by her, so you can figure that out. So Satish is saying we don't know who included in it. There's enough context for you to figure that out. Like if you say I read a book by, I read a book by James Smith, and there were vivid descriptions of crime in it. Well, we know that James Smith wrote those descriptions of crime, so that's not really the issue in this sentence because you do have enough context. So, yeah, okay. Had been included is also an issue because past perfect is. You can Google past perfect. You can look at our lessons about that. It's not appropriate here, but we don't want this to devolve into a discussion of verb tense. So the main deal here is that this is a lie, and this is the truth. Main point here again, though, is all this stuff. Modifiers have to actually modify things that make sense. And then when you have auxiliary clauses like those, they have to be placed in locations that make sentences that are not lies. So that's the deal. All right. Next, any questions? I don't see anybody typing, so let's do another problem. Okay, someone's typing. Someone, let's see what a certain someone is typing. Please type fast if you can, because I'm not exactly sure what that's supposed to say. Beasts on conventions. Let's see. That's probably just something that someone copied incorrectly. Because I didn't transcribe these. I took these from a document that was transcribed from GMAT Prep by somebody else. So that's, if you're saying you objected to it because it was plural, that's probably just someone wrote that wrong. So yeah, I don't think the actual problem would have done that. Okay, let's move on. Try that. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, and lovers and haters and rogues and all that stuff. Let's look at this problem. Here are the statistics from your class group, whatever you want to call it. So still a consensus, not such a strong one this time. But there's still a consensus here. Again, whether that comes from actually solving the problem or from having seen it before. We don't necessarily know, but at least it's something. So let's take a look. Taste buds. What's the meaning of the sentence? Remember, we want to get that first. So, taste buds are made of these taste cells, and each taste cell has a bunch of finger-like projections. So, what's the meaning? Well, what's the message? The meaning. So, taste buds have 50 to 100 taste cells. And then each taste cell has these projections. And the projections poke through an opening at the top of the taste bud. What is that opening? Like what is the taste pore? The taste pore is a name for what? What is the taste pore? Remember, this is stuff that you should figure out as you read for the first time. So yeah, the taste pore is the name of that opening. It's not the finger-like projection. One way to figure that out is that finger-like projections are plural, and there's only one opening. There's only one taste pore. So the other way you can figure it out is to know what the word pore means. It's like you have pores in your skin. Those are also openings. But there should be enough context here to figure out that the taste pore is the name of this opening. So this opening is called the taste pore. What's the meaning of the sentence? Again, you got to figure this stuff out as you go. So let's take a look. Well, it's called the taste pore. Is kind of shoved around here and written in various ways. All right. So I think we are clear on the fact that B is bad. I don't think anybody picked B. There's no they. I mean, that's the first problem there. And then also it seems to be talking about the taste bud. So which would refer to the taste bud or to the top of the taste bud. And then there's also no they. We have no idea who they is. Let's look at the modifier in C and D versus A and E. Like, remember that the taste pore is the name of the opening. So here that's not as clear. Same thing with this. This is not as good. Whereas in this choice and in this choice, at least that's more evident. So this is apparent in choices C and D, the fact that the taste pore is that. Whereas in choices A and E, it's not as clear. I mean, it's not as clear. There's also a suggestion that there may be a taste bud that is called a taste pore. So, because that's what it's attached directly to. It actually says the taste bud called the taste pore. You can still have things that like this that work because, you know, if you have a bunch of modifiers, then you have to put some of them after some others. But when you're given an option, remember that modifier placement is relative. It's not like absolutely where do these have to go. It's which placement makes the most sense. And that's something you shouldn't lose sight of. Very, very, very important. Modifier placement is relative. Like, the issue is not like where is the absolutely correct place to put these. Because usually there's lots of ways you could arrange that. So there's not going to be one true way. But instead, the issue really is which choice does the best job of placing the modifiers correctly and clearly. It's relative. You're just judging the choices against the other choices. You're not judging absolutely here. So in that sort of sense, we can tell that A and E are worse than C and D. Okay. What about this? Each of which has, each of which having. Well, remember that each of which works like which. So which has to have a what that goes with it. Anybody know? Like what has to come after which, or each of which? It's got to have a verb. Right. I mean, which has to be the subject of some verb. So you can't use which without a verb. And then the same goes for each of which and other things like that. So each of which having is not okay. Each of which has is. So there you go. Any questions about this stuff? Again, as far as modifier lessons go, the main point here is that placement is a relative issue, meaning you don't have to have some prescriptive way of saying this is absolutely where these things have to go, because it doesn't work like that. But it's just which choice does the best job of this, which choice makes this most clear. I have a question about them in A. Them definitely does not always have to refer to people. I mean, them can be, it's like they. I mean, they is that's the only plural pronoun you really have, right? So I had 4 really nice plates, but I broke 2 of them. That's how you would say that. I mean, them is the plates. So, but let's talk about each of which and each of them real quick, and then we'll call it a day here. So here's the same problem. Watch out for run-on sentences. I mean, a run-on sentence is, remember, a run-on sentence is when you have 2 sentences that are just stuck together with a comma or something. So if you say, I have 1 brother, comma, he is a sales manager. This is not a sentence. This is 2 sentences. And so it's incorrect. Like, this would be a sentence all by itself. I did Google that term independent clause during the break. So for those of you who know that term, these are both what you would call independent clauses. You don't really have to know words like that. I don't know words like that, but if you want to know those words, there they are. Like, the point is that this is something that could be a complete sentence by itself. And so is this. And so you can't just graft those to each other with a comma. You can't just say, I have 1 brother, because I have 1 brother is a sentence. He is a sales manager is another sentence. So that's what these things like who and which and stuff, that's what those things do. They let you graft things to other things. So I have 1 brother, comma, who is a sales manager. That's correct. And of course, if you actually break this into 2 sentences, I have 1 brother, period, he is a sales manager, then that's choppy and it's not beautiful writing, but it's correct. And you're not going to see that anyway, because in sentence correction, it's always one sentence. So you will never see things broken up like this, because it wouldn't be a sentence anymore if they did that. So in terms of each of which, it's the same thing. Like if you say, taste buds are blah, 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 comma, each of them has X. That's a run-on sentence because that's two sentences. And like if you actually wrote those as separate entities, as separate sentences, taste buds are blah, 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 period. Each of them has blah. This would be correct. I mean, you're not going to see it written as two sentences, but if it would work as two sentences, then it definitely doesn't work as one. And then if you have taste buds are blah, 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 comma, each of which, then that works. So, I mean, the which here is kind of like the who up there. Like it relates back to the other clause and lets you stick these things together. The person calling yourself Thursdays with Ron, if it's in the correct answer, you know the answer to that. I mean, it's in the correct answer, so guess not. Remember also that wordiness is not an actual criterion for eliminating stuff. I mean, there's no such thing as a choice that's just wrong because it has too many words. So be very, very careful with that. That's also something that would be relative if you were going to judge it. Like you can say certain things have more words than they need compared to other things, but you would not look at one choice and say that it was wordy. The word each is, yeah, and then also B and E are, Kurt is correct about B and E. You can't put each of which with a plural, because each is singular. So each of them have not okay, each of which have not okay either. That's a good observation. Okay, so again, the main thrust as far as today goes is like this stuff again with throwing modifiers around. Modifier placement. When you see a bunch of stuff pushed around, you should think of that as a split. You should not think of that as a number of splits. You should just think of it as a split. That whole moving around of everything is a single split. It's not a bunch of splits. So, and then when you have to resolve that, it's really a relatively simple issue of just what should go next to what. Kurt, not necessarily. I mean, it all depends on what you see first. Like the best answer to that question is no. Because if I tell you yes to that, then what's going to happen is you're going to see this kind of issue, and then you're going to still sit on it and look for other stuff. And that's bad. Like, you don't have a ton of time here, and you're not going to find everything in the world. So you got to have the attitude of, if I see something like this, then I'm just going to capitalize on it, and then worry about it later. So that's the better way to think about it. Okay, so we didn't really talk much about that modifiers, but placement was the theme of today. Probably do some more stuff on modifiers next time. But thank you for attending, and good times for everybody. Okay, so if you have any quick administrative questions, feel free to shoot those in the chat box. Questions that are actual admin stuff, not questions about GMAT problems, please. And I'll take those real quick. Can we access the class recording? Yeah, it's on the Thursdays with Ron page. If you just Google up Thursdays with Ron, it'll take you there. And then if you scroll down, the recordings are all on that page. So you don't even have to click anything. It's right there. So, yep. Okay. There's a lot of them. There's like 60 recordings. So if you're just discovering this, then there's going to be a lot for you to look at. All right, I think that's it. So we're going to go ahead and kill it. In about 30 seconds, I'm going to go ahead and start logging you guys out. I'm going to pause the recording. And good night and good luck.